when you're praying, or you're walking and praying, that you just want to say, Lord, I just love you. You know, just you're bubbling in your heart. Say, oh, Lord, I love you. I'm always reminded of this song and then Psalms 116. I love the Lord because, and then he gives a list of the way he loves the Lord. But sometimes it just comes right out. You know, God, you're so good to me. I just love you, Lord. I don't always understand what you're doing, but I love you. And I think as Christians, that's the point that God's aiming for all the time. He's aiming for us to have a relationship with him, not religion. Religion says, what do I have to do, Lord? That relationship said, Lord, I love you. I know you love me, I love you. I really, to me, it's one of the most important things to teach people that it's a relationship with God, and that it's a love relationship, and he loves you. I don't care who you are. He loves you. He's going to love you today. He's going to love you tomorrow. He's going to love you every day. It's not whether you do enough to keep up with that, or whether you check off all these things. He loves you. And to me, that was the most liberating thing in my life, to know that I don't have to earn it. That tomorrow when I get up, even though I blew it, he still loves me. All right? We're in Galatians chapter 2, and we're in verse number 3. Galatians chapter 2, verse 3. We probably gained a verse or two since you know.
How many verses did we get?
Yeah, probably not a whole. Well, one day I think you covered 3 or 4 of them. So we're in Galatians chapter 2, verse 3 right now. All right? And I will tell you this, just by way of commercial. If you wonder what you missed, they're in the file. Walt's made sure they're there. You can go back and pick them up. Right, Walt? They're right there. All right. So Galatians chapter 2, verse 3. We're talking about the gospel, and that's what reminded me of how much I love the Lord and how much is built on this love relationship. And you know, I did the funeral service for Kelly Gregory on Monday, and the only thing I preached is John 3:16. And so I just wanted people to know the simplicity of the gospel. I don't want anybody confused, and I would tell you that the room that was full, and I would tell you they were listening because it was quiet. Nobody responded or anything, but I would tell you that I walked out of there thinking, maybe it was a good job and he wasn't, but I felt like, God, you told me that you wanted me to preach the gospel, and that's all I did. I felt wonderful. I really did. A lot of times I do funeral service and I feel awful because nobody was listening and everything. I just felt wonderful because I thought God had just put this on my heart to just preach to you, John 3:16, and that's exactly what we did. Anyways, this is sort of what Paul must be feeling like. Knock it off. Quit trying to add to the gospel. It's the same. And we've gone through this, I know, and it's hard for me not to recap the whole book of Galatians every time we get back in here. But we know that Paul is writing because these people were being sucked into a gospel that really wasn't the gospel. They were being sucked into this idea that it's not salvation by grace, it's salvation by grace plus keeping the law. This was a really challenge. It was a really big challenge. Paul was frustrated by that. And then to top it all off, the people were saying, Paul, you weren't really an apostle. You weren't one of the 12. And then, Paul, where'd you get your gospel? You're changing the gospel. And you should go back to the law. You had to have the law along with the gospel. And Paul, as we've gone through this, Paul simply says, it didn't come from anywhere but God. God gave me this good news. I believed in the good news. So God gave it to me, this gospel, the gospel by grace, and it's the same when I preach. And we've gone through all chapter 1 dealing with that. Paul says, you can't tell me it came from anywhere else because before I got saved, I was as stuck in the law as anybody else. Before I got saved, I all believed in all the works and everything else. And then I met the Lord, and my life changed. And then he began to declare the gospel. You see this all along here. And Paul goes into great detail in chapter 1 telling us, I didn't go back to the apostles. As soon as I got saved, I didn't go to the apostles. I went out in Arabia, spent some time there, went back to Damascus, and then after 3 years I went down to Jerusalem, met with just a couple, just Peter and James, only for 15 days, and then I went back up to Tarsus, and I stayed there for a while until I got called into Antioch. And then, when we pick it up in chapter 2, he says, and by the way, 14 years have passed before I went down to Jerusalem. This is pretty neat. So Paul says, total, really, he's saying 17 years since the time I got saved to the time I actually went to the apostles and talked to the apostles. And his whole point was, my gospel came from the Lord. It didn't come from the apostles. The apostles didn't give me this gospel. I got it from the Lord. And then and here's what he's saying in this section. And when I finally went down to Jerusalem, they agreed. They agreed it was the same gospel they were preaching as I was preaching here. I remember going to Seattle when they had the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't know if anybody else went there. They had parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls down in Seattle. We went down and walked through it, and I'm always amazed reading and studying about the Dead Sea Scrolls that when they have entire copies of the book of Isaiah. Now I've lost the dates here. 200, 400. What is it? 400 BC.
For the writings of those scrolls?
Yeah.
About 200.
200. I would say 200, 400. I'm only off 200 years. Okay. All right. And what amazes me is that it lines right up with what we still have. In other words, God protected His Word through all these years, but copy by copy by copy by copy, not by Xerox machines or anything else, but handwritten copies passed down. And we have the book of Isaiah, and you can line it up with the scrolls in here with very little variance involved in this. And it's the same thing that Paul was interested in. Paul wants you to know that when I went and preached the gospel, the one that God gave me, it turns out to be the same gospel that God gave the apostles. No difference, no change. In fact, when we compare them, he's going to say, they said, hey, that's exactly what we got. And this is what Paul was concerned about. So when people came along and said to Paul, that gospel of grace, that one that says that you're loved by God, and He's going to give the gift of salvation, that salvation is a gift given by His love and not by keeping the law, Paul says that gospel is the same one I'm preaching. And when the Judaizers came in and said, you got to add the Old Testament law, you got to keep the law, you got to be faithful to be circumcised, you got to keep the law, and then you'd be saved, Paul says, nope, that's not it. And then they said, well, Paul, you're changing it. No, Paul says, no, it's the gospel God gave me, and it's the same one the apostles gave. So let's pick up in verse number, I'll read the first two verses to start with here, chapter 2 of Galatians. Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation and communicated unto them that gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. So Paul says, after 14 years, I finally went up to Jerusalem. I took Barnabas with me. I took Titus with me. And Titus is pretty key in a few seconds here. I took Titus with me, who was a Greek, with a Greek background. He wasn't a Jew. He wasn't a saved Jew. He was a saved Greek. And he said, and I went there, because God led me to go there. By revelation of God, I went there. And I took my gospel, the one that I was preaching to the Gentiles, and I showed it to these leaders privately. I showed them, this is what I'm preaching on. This is the gospel I'm preaching on. And Paul says, the reason I did that, lest I should run or had run in vain. I want to make sure that what I'm saying isn't missing the mark, or they're not getting the full message, or whatever you want to identify as. I want to make sure that it's all lined up. That it was keep on lining up here. I always find it amazing whenever anybody talks about we were a full gospel ministry. I'm thinking, what are we? A half gospel ministry? We're a full gospel ministry too. But what they usually say is full gospel being a Pentecostal movement of some sort. But Paul would say, hey, we got the whole gospel. We don't need to add anything else to it here. And that's what I want to check out on. Verse number 2. Verse number 3 is where we left off at here. He says, but neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Now, this is I think a very unique statement. So Paul comes up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and they're going to have this meeting here. We read the whole chapter last week in Acts chapter, almost the whole chapter in Acts chapter 15 last week, and talking about that Jerusalem council that went on there. And when Paul came up, he brought Titus. Now Titus is a Greek. He's not half Greek. Timothy was a Jewish mom and a Greek dad, but Titus was whole Greek, all Greek. In other words, no Jewish background in him that we know about here. And Paul, when he came to share the gospel, came down to Jerusalem to tell them about the Jews, the Gentiles getting saved, he brought Exhibit A with him. Here's Titus. All right. Now I don't know much about Titus. If I'm not mistaken, the book of Acts doesn't even mention Titus. I could be wrong. You go back and check on sure exactly where it came from, off the top of my head at least. Maybe you can correct me on that one too. All right? But Titus was one of those troubleshooters, if you will, where Paul would send one of his protégés somewhere so that they could minister to them, maybe handle some difficulties and problems, and come back and report back to Paul along the way here. But Paul, I believe, specifically brought Titus with him down to Jerusalem as an exhibit of this is what a Greek Christian looks like, if you will. In other words, I'm going to tell you all about ministry. I'm going to tell you all about people getting saved. I'm going to tell you about everything that's related to that. All these Gentiles get saved. But here's one. Here's an example of it. Maybe it wouldn't be quite that directly, but this is sort of where he was heading for. Because if you read verse 3, he says, "But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised." So Titus came down to Jerusalem. He got saved. He came down to Jerusalem. There they're talking about salvation by grace and not the law. Remember they said in Acts 15, they said that they should require everybody to follow the law of Moses. And that was the whole issue. And to be circumcised. And Paul said, I brought Titus down. He wasn't circumcised. He wasn't compelled to be circumcised. We didn't want him to be circumcised here. So Paul is sort of holding him up and saying, and guess what? The apostles there, the ones who appeared for him, didn't make them be circumcised. Didn't demand them to be circumcised. So here's the whole argument. The gospel is not being changed by saying it's only grace. When you say we have to add the law, I want to tell you, when I went down to the apostles after 17 years of preaching this gospel, the apostles didn't make Titus get circumcised. He wasn't made to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. And so this is part of the sort of overall approach to proving that his gospel was the right gospel. That's the gospel of grace minus works here. Now, if you go back in the book of Acts, I think it's Acts chapter 16, you find out that Timothy had a different situation here. And if I don't hit it the first time, I won't try, but I believe it's Acts 16 here. Yeah, Acts 16 verse 1. Then came he to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Jewess, and believed, but his father was a Greek, which was well reported of by the brethren that were at Lystra and Iconium. Him would Paul have to go forth with them, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. So this is a little bit different situation here. So Paul says, Titus, we didn't make him get circumcised. He was a Greek, and we didn't make him get circumcised.
According to the Jews, you're a Jew if your mother is a Jew, not your father. So they would consider him a Jew because his mother was a Jew.
Yeah, and in order for him to follow Paul in the synagogues and to be in all these other places, circumcision had to be part of it. And so what Paul was doing, in Timothy's case, Paul wasn't saying to Timothy, you're not saved till you get circumcised. Paul was saying, you're saved. Now, because of your Jewish background, because we want to minister to the Jews, we're going to circumcise you here. Had nothing to do with earning a salvation. It had to do with spreading the gospel. Yes?
I remember asking the professor one time, how do they know whether someone was circumcised or not when they went into the temple? And he said they must have carried certificates with them that
Either certificates or show of power. All right. Yeah, that's always interested me. I mean, I was on the...
I was always wondering, I was curious, how do they know whether they're circumcised?
I always wonder if only you would ask it.
I asked all the questions.
Spirit.
I love to be reading stories.
Yeah.
All right. Now we don't have to ask it anymore. Now we know. You ask the question. Sort of like what Peter did. Peter asked all kinds of questions, said many things, and the rest of the disciples said, that was stupid. What was the answer? I don't have to ask that one anymore. Peter did that for us. And so you see, Titus is an example. And in Titus' case, now if they brought Titus down and he was circumcised down there, that would have shattered the gospel of grace. They would have simply said, oh, see, you have to be circumcised in order to be here. And Paul says, no, we brought him down there. He didn't feel the need. The apostles didn't make him do it. And that's why Titus and Timothy has a different background involved in it. Verse number 4, we'll pick up verse 4. And that, because of false brethren, unawares, brought in, who came in privately to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us an it's not wrong, or it's not something you can't see what they're saying, but it's just the sequence of the words are just a little hard to follow here. I wrote down in my notes, read it from the Amplified Version, and I didn't bring the Amplified Version, so I won't read it here. But New American Standard says, but it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us to bondage. So Paul's telling this story here. We went down there, and Titus wasn't circumcised. We didn't need to. We went down and spoke and showed our gospel to the apostles, so they could look at it privately. They could see what it is here. And we found out that people were sneaking in. Now, I'm not sure if this is referring to while he's down there or after he left. But here's what he said. There were people who were coming into our congregation, if you will, and spying on us to see if we're keeping the law or not. Now, this is a pretty amazing thing for him to say this. And the words that are used here, the word King James says false brethren. In New English it says sham Christians. I like that. Sham Christians here. The word is pseudo-adelphius. Adelphius being brother and pseudo being fake or phony. So a fake brother, so false brother is what the translation is here. And this speaks of their motive and their method here. Their method is to get into the body, spy it out, and the motive is to point them out and say, see, they're not keeping the law. This is sort of what happens when we build everything in our Christian life with a legalistic system. There's always going to be somebody who is more legalistic than you are. All right? In other words, somebody who has a higher standard than you will look down and say, hey, you don't do what we do. All right? I know this. I came from the independent Baptist background, and our independent Baptist church is here, and pretty strict, I'll tell you. You know, we didn't want to sing any hymns that made you tap your feet. We couldn't do that because it was dancing almost. And I shared with you, I think the men's group, you couldn't have any hair touching your ears, and you couldn't have wire-rimmed glasses because that was too modern. You had to have the black ones. There were so many rules and regulations. Just start that. I don't know if anybody has been into anybody here been to an independent? Our rules were pretty strong. All right, and I bet you they were stronger than yours. No. And this is what I found though. I went to some conferences with them, and I found that when you got around talking with them, they talked about where their rules were. And you almost think that they have one up on you on something. And then other churches had more rules. It was a very legalistic system. So this is when you start building your relationship with God on rules, everybody's going to change the rules. And this is what happened with the Pharisees. Because we had the commandments of God, that wasn't enough. We have to interpret the commandments and add more commandments to them to make it even more stricter. All right? And they couldn't keep the commandments, so they couldn't keep it, but we're still going to plow it on here. And so here, Paul speaks about these false brethren that came in unawares, and it came privately to spy out our liberty. What were they looking for? Just to see our liberty. Where we have liberty in the Lord. Remember this, I talked with somebody today, and they were talking about their opinion of Paul, and they thought Paul was so legalistic, and the legalism never got out of him. And it's funny because I was reading Galatians at the time, and they came in to talk, and all the things that were being said were contrary to what Paul was saying. Because Paul did come from a legalistic background. And this person said, he never got rid of it. It's always been there. And I said, no, I do believe he did get rid of it here. And for Galatians, it makes it very clear. Paul had that very legalistic background, but he believed in the liberty of Jesus. We're not bound by a law. We're bound by the Spirit of God who leads us. We couldn't keep the law in the first place. But the Spirit of God leads us and gives us, empowers us to be able to live the life that's pleasing to God here. Oftentimes, we find, even today, that people are trying to add something to that simple gospel. Galatians, the same book, chapter 5, verse 1. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ has made you free. And be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. All right? The next verse. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. In other words, if you think circumcision is going to save you, Christ will profit doesn't. You can't mix the law with grace in order to get salvation. It's grace, and then it's plus grace. That's it. It's just grace. All right? And I think it's important that Paul was saying this here. People are actually coming in the midst to try to find God, and he closes that the verse with, that they might bring us into bondage. In other words, you're free from all that law, but we want to come in, spy you out, and bring you back into bondage again. And Paul would have nothing to do with that. He didn't want anything to do with that. That's what he said. I didn't get the gospel from anybody. God gave it to me, and I went and confirmed it with the apostles, and it was the same gospel, and we're not adding no law to this. We're not adding any law to this. All right? And I think that's so important. We got to still stand the ground. We got to stand the ground on this issue. You can't add anything to the law to make it any better. It's absolutely perfect here. And our liberty sets us free from the bondage of the law. It sets us free from the bondage of sin. We know that already. John chapter 8, verse 32, 42, something like that. If the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. And in that same section it says that he who sins becomes a servant of sin.
Well, I appreciate Paul having that problem, but I think we live kind of in the opposite of that. It's like most churches, anything goes,
Yeah.
as long as you don't kill somebody.
Which reminds me, I wrote down a few verses that tie in with that liberty. Galatians chapter 5, verse number 13 says this. It says, for brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Oh, there it is. We're set free. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another. In other words, you have liberty, but don't go saying, I got so much liberty, I can go live in the flesh now. Just like Tom was saying. It doesn't work that way. Our liberty doesn't set us free to go sin. Our liberty sets us free from sin. We don't have that bondage that we're under in that area there. And I wrote down, let's see if I give you one more. Romans chapter 6, verse 18. All right. Thank you, Tom, for playing into my notes. All right. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you take me way off my notes, and I don't know what to say. But Romans 6:18 says, being then made free from sin, you shall become the servants of righteousness. And I think that's a great statement that makes in here. We have the liberty that the whole world needs. And then we have religious people who are saying, no, you need more rules. You need more law. You got to do more works in order to keep this liberty. No, I'm saved by grace, and my salvation will be kept by the grace of God. I want to serve him now, and I don't want to live in sin because I experience grace. I want to do it out of love. I want to live the life that God wants me to live here. Okay, go back to our text. We got 2 verses today. How about that? All right, we can get a third one. I just know it. All right. Anybody have any comment about verse 3 and 4? All right. Verse 5. We'll finish with verse 5 today. To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. And then there's a couple things I'm going to point out here. Let me read it from the New American Standard here. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour. The NIV says, we did not give unto them for a moment. That's what he's saying here. So they came out, they spied us out, they're trying to find, where our freedom was, our liberty was, and they want to bring us back into the bondage. And incidentally, I would say that Paul was aware that even in the first century, the church had phoniness in it. All right? They had people that would come into church and divide it. I think we sometimes forget that it was going on in Paul's day. Paul says in Acts chapter 20, when he's talking to the elders in Ephesus and Miletus, he tells them there's going to come a time that people will come from the outside in and mislead the church. And Paul understood this, the future of the church. You see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul says there are false brethren. There are false prophets. There are false teachers who bring a false gospel. You read that all in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And Paul's warning them here. I want you to understand that just because you're in the group, or just because all your group seems to come together, doesn't mean everybody's on the same page there. Remember, there was 12 apostles, but one of them was Judas. All right? And he was right there in the midst there. So Paul understood that. So here in verse 5, verse 4, he tells us they're here spying us out. And he said, but we did not give them a place even for a moment. In other words, we didn't bat our eye. We didn't say, okay, you might be right. Maybe we should do a little bit of law. Maybe we should may sound harsh to Paul. You can imagine Paul coming into these small churches, young churches, people come in, they seem pretty wise. They from a Jewish background, they're telling you they came from the apostles, and they're saying, but Paul's giving you the wrong information, and you guys shouldn't have all this liberty, and the Lord should be following the law. Paul says, we didn't give him 1 inch. We didn't give him a moment of time. We stopped him right there here. Paul's preached a pretty hard-line gospel. I would say when you read this thing, you got to marvel at Paul's courage. And his courage is only matched by one other thing, that's his conviction. All right? He is convicted, totally convinced in his heart that this gospel of grace, not by works, not by keeping a law, has got to stay firm. You can't change it whatsoever here. And then he says that the truth of the gospel may continue with you. A couple translations, so the truth of the gospel would remain with you, or so the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. The word continue means having a permanent state with you. So Paul's goal was to keep the gospel pure, unchanged, unadulterated, untainted. Remember back in chapter 1, verse 7, he said that there are people coming here perverting the gospel. He says, my goal is not to make a single move here. It's not going to be changed. I'm going to preserve it for you. And to me, we're reminded how important doctrinal issues are. Paul, so many times people sort of flippantly say, as long as we get along, it doesn't matter what we believe. Or they'll have this idea that peace in the church is better than truth in the church. And they may not say it that way, but that's the way in which they hear it. The truth of the matter is, you can have all the peace in the world. Without truth, that peace is not going to last. The only thing that binds us together is the truth of God. And that's what brings us together. I have very little in common with anybody here. I like baseball. Tony likes baseball. Let's see. Bill is pastor, so I'm okay with Bill. Mark likes to hike. I like to hike too. Very little in common with you guys. But we do have the truth of the gospel, yes.
Well, you like ice cream, don't you?
I love ice cream.
Well, there you
Me
go.
and Jerry we're on the same page right here. Right?
Bob and Jerry's. Never got no ice cream.
But Paul, the thing I want you to notice here is that Paul doesn't compromise on the doctrine. So the message is uncompromising. The methods are tremendously open. You read in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul said, well, to those under the law, I'll be under the law. For those not under the law, I'll be without the law here. Paul said, I can be all things to everybody that might by some means win somebody to Christ. So Paul says, here, the message stays. There, the ministry and the method can go all over the place. But the message has to stay. And if you notice one more thing, and we're done here. One more thing. To whom he gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. So Paul was saying, it's not about me. It's not about me getting the pats on the back and everything else. He says, I want the truth to be forever with you. And that just reminds us that whenever anybody's tinkering with the gospel, whenever somebody's coming to your door, knocking on your door, telling you about some other gospel there, in whatever form it takes, there comes a time to be polite. You should always be polite, I think. And if they're open to listen, most times they're not open to listen. They're open to tell you what they believe, but not to listen. That's great. But when it comes down to them trying to convince you of a truth that's not there, it's not the gospel, then it's time to close it down and say that's it. And remember, John tells us, don't wish him Godspeed. If anybody brings another gospel to you, or another truth to you, don't wish him Godspeed. Don't say good luck on you. No, you got to cut it off. Because Paul said, I was willing to fight this. In fact, remember chapter 1, he said, I wish them to be accursed if anybody brings another gospel in this one. In other words, I wish them to be damned if they bring another gospel here in this one. Okay, we'll stop there at verse 6. And man, we sailed along on that so far fast. 3 verses. All right. Anybody have any comment? Where'd you go?
One thing I appreciate about Paul is that he does not compromise the truth. Like he said, he became all things to all people, and the gospel can be shared in many different ways. But he never compromised the truth
Yeah.
of the simple truth of the gospel.
Yeah, I think that that's where we should stand. I mean, a lot of times we get so old, and for instance, sometimes we get so stuck in the rut, we say that church services have to go this way. They have to be sung this way. It's got to have this is the order of service, and this is the way it's got to be because we did it 50 years ago that same way. And people get really, oh man, look at they're changing everything. Hey, just don't change the message. The truth of the Bible is still the truth of the Bible. Present it, and that's why we got to adapt ourselves to whatever position wherever we're on a vacation. We got to adapt ourselves. So we're not going to stand up in the middle of the bus and preach. Or maybe not. I don't think you guys do. But you adapt yourself. Is there other opportunities I have? More chances. Maybe sitting at a table. Maybe as we walk along. Maybe as we see something beautiful. However it is, we want to bring God back into the conversation here. And that's very, very important for us here. And do not believe that. Don't be so what's the word? So shallow. Don't be so shallow and to believe that the doctrines of the Bible are unimportant. Because we should contend for the faith once given to the apostles. And Jude basically say that. That's what we're fighting for, the faith, the truth, the body of truth that gave to the apostles. We have to fight for that. All right? So don't go the other direction, say, your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth, it's okay as long as we get along and we love the same God. No. The whole Bible is telling us truth. We got to stick to what the Bible says and it's truth here. At the same time, make sure you're not so isolating yourself that you can't change the method along the way in order to improve on the ministry along the way here. All right. Paul is going to be called to the Gentiles. Peter was called to the Jews. And so I'm so glad that God added another piece to this puzzle. Otherwise, we wouldn't have got saved if it wasn't for the Gentiles. Bill, that's Bill.
Yeah, I was just thinking about all that he said here that, I mean, last week and then the week before that, and you're talking about how, you know, he's gone off to Arabia, you know, came back to Damascus, and he'd been for 3 years. He went back to Jerusalem, and then he went off for 14 years and came back to Jerusalem. I mean, there had been some time gone by, and now he comes in, and he said there, let's see, verse 4, you just read there that false brethren were secretly brought in. I'm wondering who brought them in. I mean, you know, we talked last week for a while about the importance of keeping the word true and preaching the same gospel even today that was preached by Paul back then. And I mean, this is typical of what the devil does to try to dilute the gospel and try to make it ineffective. And this is why it's so more important, as you just said, to stand and believe the doctrines of the Bible, and that we not only teach them, but we live by them. I mean, we have to sharpen our sword every day and make it effective. And Paul said, you know, he came back and they're bringing in people who I don't know who did it. He didn't name them, but they're bringing in people who were false brethren, these pseudo brothers. And I'm just thinking, how much have we seen that in our day and age? And God forbid that we should be guilty ourselves of bringing in false brethren or whatever the case may be. And the gospel needs to be shared and told.
Yeah, I think it's okay if lost people come in. And
Yeah, you want the lost.
Yeah, we're going to win the lost. But when people come in that don't believe the gospel, they're coming in to change your mind about the gospel. That's what you got to know. And here's what I always like. Paul was willing to bend over backwards for weak believers. We read that in the men's meeting this past week. Weak believers, Paul said that we should bend over backwards for them. But phony believers, he's not going to give them an inch, not even a moment of time. Those are two things totally different along the way. Right.
Mark, we had talked about it this last Sunday night, but before it talks about Paul, you know, talking about eating meat offered to idols, where, you know, a lot of Christians wouldn't do that, but it was more important for a relationship with the young Christians than to, you know, get all up and, well, you know, I don't eat meat offered to idols. So sometimes we have to, as older, more mature believers, have to overlook some things, you know, that we don't really like,
we get so up to date that we think that we created the line. We're the line there, line of supporting our weaker brothers. We have to encourage them. If that means some sacrifice we may along the way.
I just want to say, my spirit, it makes me walk the same path as every other human, you know, that's in the flesh and stuff. It had me look at my blood here a while back. I cut myself, and it had me put the drop in the mirror and take the camera and take a picture of it. But when I did, it showed up the story of Calvary. I've got a little red cross, and you look under my microscope and drop my blood, it shows the real story of Calvary and all this. And my spirit lets me know more and more as we go. And also, I know I can take it right down to commandment. And I don't tell a lot of people about this, but if you take me somewhere someone's really sick, I'll write down commandments for that person may well, and I guarantee you by the next day, that sickness is gone, they confess when they've seen the sin. I did this before down in the church down in Tennessee, healed people, and had great results. I just don't go around. I haven't put me on TV or nothing like that. It's like my spirit communicates with the spirit, and then it leads to the person. My buddy's spirit, we go there and we do work, and then we'll travel on and go to the next place. But ultimately, that's how I got past here at Tennessee up here. My spirit started talking to me after I got out of prison. I died there and was dead for like over an hour. And I got all the marks of Calvary on me too, Jesus Christ, spirit, death, and all that. And I was dead for an hour, and then I woke back, and they called my people back, and I said, well, he's back alive again. He died, he's back. And ever since then, I've had a lot of fuzziness in my life. What's going on? But my spirit keeps on talking to me. And every time I follow my spirit in these ways, what it wants, it's leading more and more truth. You know, more purity. More purity. I keep on seeing these awesome things, and also being a deity for all the people. My spirit shows you stuff like that, where all the people's been shrunk down to where they live, and basically keep on side the heart, mind, body, spirit. My spirit can take, and it probably shows you. It's got a little key ring, have that little planets on it. He'll show it to you every once in a while, depending on where you're at and you're calling and stuff. Yeah, Alpha, Omega. Looks like really shit in my relation.
Stay in the Word. Keep in the Word.
Yeah.
Anything, keep in the Word. And then find a good place where you can just settle down and be taught and grow. And that's the key thing about your relationship. And then God uses it. Uses you everywhere you go. All right. Just 10 minutes over today. That's all. All right. Let's go to the word of prayer, and I'm going to ask Jerry to lead us in the word of prayer, please.
Lord Jesus, we are so grateful that salvation depends on your grace and not our works, because we would never come close. So we rejoice in that, Lord. We're thankful for the Apostle Paul and his insistence on that, and we're thankful that Pastor Bob preaches the gospel of grace through faith. So keep us on that straight and narrow path, Lord, and help us to understand that